All right, if I could please have your attention. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask before I begin my lecture for today? Anything that comes to mind that we've talked about up till this point in time? Any questions about anything? All right, so I'm going to take a few minutes, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes at most, I think, to wrap up my discussion on the question of women in India. I had started talking to you in the closing minutes of my last lecture about the issue of dowry, something I've spoken about at some length. But I want to give you a fuller picture of what's involved there and some of the considerations that we'd have to keep in mind. So I'll start with that and make a few general observations, and that will conclude my discussion of the place of women in India, women in the public sphere, because remember that that's a larger rubric under which we're looking at these questions. What is the place of women in India post-1947? And one of the things I attempted to do in my previous lecture was to try to situate that within a slightly longer-term perspective by going back to the first half of the 19th century and suggesting to you that one of the reasons why worldwide the status of women is always under consideration is because there is a kind of a tacit understanding that one of the ways in which we're going to now evaluate a country, particularly in relation to other countries, is by looking at how this country, a particular country, treats its women. And I was suggesting to you that this is in fact a kind of a template that came into place in the early 19th century, and that in the 19th century the conclusion certainly of the colonial state was that India was exceedingly backwards because of the various kinds of problems that afflicted women. This is not to say, by the way, I think that should be self-evident, but sometimes one has to mention things that are self-evident, that there are obviously a huge number of problems that were afflicting men as well. So that if we're looking at problems of class, we're looking at problems of access to health care, well, these are not necessarily problems that are particular only to women and to girls. They may be more adversely affected, which is one reason why it has to be given special attention. They may be more adversely affected than might boys and men. And in fact, I have given several illustrations of that in my previous lecture. Now, let me go back to the issue of dowry. So remember that I laid out sort of the problematic for you, that the problematic for us is how does one explain, and this is a problematic that can be viewed in relation to a number of other questions as well, how does one try to explain the fact that something like dowry deaths have taken place in India in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. One doesn't hear about that phenomenon much more these days, which is not to say that they've completely disappeared. I think that they have diminished a great deal. But of course, there are a great many other problems now which afflict women in particular, right? But the problematic is that on the one hand, women's literacy rates went up, women got more educated. Supposedly, we became a more modern and progressive society. And if we did, then the question really is, how does one try to understand a phenomenon such as dowry deaths? And if you're thinking, well, what kind of statistics are we talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is that in the 1990s, in India, I mean, without giving you particular figures, I could give you exact figures because I have them, but broadly speaking, we're talking about between 4,500 and 6,500 women who were reported to have been killed on account of dowry deaths every year. And then there are some other things that are rather astonishing and puzzling about it, such as the fact that the vast majority of these dowry deaths took place in North India. Why in North India? Is South India much more progressive than North India? Is it the case that investigative journalism is more prevalent in North India than it is in South India? Right? So if you were a scholar of this particular subject, then you'd obviously have to ask a great many questions. And then let's refine these questions a bit further. Do these dowry deaths take place across all communities in North India? Do they take place in Brahmin families and Kshatriya families? Do they take place in upper class families, lower class families? And what about the urban-rural divide? So here's another interesting fact. The vast majority of these dowry deaths took place in urban India. And there were some social commentators who argued, well, that the reason why we think they take place in urban India is because urban India is under the gaze of the media. That there's a lot more media attention paid to what happens in Delhi or Bangalore or some town in North India than the kind of attention we would pay or lavish on a small little village. Who cares about the rural countryside, right? So these are the ways in which you would begin to refine the question, and I'm not going to give you all the answers, because then, again, as has been the case with many other subjects, we'd have to do an exhaustive study of this question, and we're not really doing that here. We're trying to understand what might be some of the problems that A, afflict women, B, trying to explain them within the problematic that on the one hand you have progress, apparently progress, society is becoming more modern. On the other hand, you have a phenomenon such as dowry deaths. Thirdly, why is this phenomenon confined to urban areas? And I already indicated to you the way in which these dowry deaths were orchestrated. Let me also mention a couple of legislative measures. So, over 5 decades ago, an act was passed, which is the Prohibition of Dowry Act. So the Prohibition of Dowry Act states very clearly that the giving and taking of dowry is illegal. Right? It's not simply the groom's family which is to be held legally accountable if they demand dowry when the woman comes into the home. Right? A woman gets married, and what does a woman when she gets married ordinarily do in those kinds of societies? She would move into her parents' home, into her husband's home, and her husband most likely in a traditional setting would actually be staying with his parents. It would be a joint family. Now we know that, by the way, and again, we haven't studied changing family structures in the post-1947 period. That's another big subject, because obviously family structures have changed as they've changed here. The traditional definition of the family has completely changed in fundamental respects in the United States over the course of the last 3 to 4 decades. Now, I don't think the changes are that sweeping in India. Nowhere as sweeping, but one of the changes that one certainly does see is the decline of what was called the joint family. And particularly in urban areas, if you happen to be a highly educated urban male and you marry a woman, the likelihood is not small. It's probably even. I don't know what the statistics are on that, but there is a good likelihood that you will now set up an independent house. But in most of these cases where we're talking about where dowry deaths took place, the woman actually moved into her husband's home, and her husband was himself actually staying with his parents, and there might have been others in that joint family too. There might have been grandparents, paternal grandparents, there might have been a younger brother with his wife, perhaps, right? So that's what a joint family would be. And what we're saying is that the Prohibition of Dowry Act stipulates very clearly that the giving and taking of dowry is illegal. That is, that both the bride's family and the groom's family are actually committing a legal offense. Right? Now, guess how many prosecutions took place under the Prohibition of Dowry Act in the first 10 years? About 1 a year. Okay? I mean, there are millions of people who are giving and taking dowry. Millions of people. Nobody is, in fact, actually being prosecuted under this act. And that's an interesting problem in itself. And the problem there is that what relationship does legislation have to a particular society? Do you transform a society simply by passing legislation? Right? If a law was passed in the United States saying that we must love our neighbor regardless of their color or their gender, so will we start loving them? And let's not talk about loving in the carnal sense, you know what I mean, of course, that you say that, well, I'm going to treat my neighbor really fairly, doesn't matter whether they're short or tall, thin or fat, black or brown, female or male. Right? No law can make you do that. Affection cannot be manufactured by law. It has to be produced by a different kind of social process. So what we're saying is that the Prohibition of Dowry Act, it wasn't simply toothless. The criticism that social activists would give is it's toothless. If the government decides that it's going to implement it, well, it's going to implement it. Well, frankly, I don't think it's as simple as that. Because when you have a social process which has really enormously wide implications, you do not simply alter it by passing a piece of legislation, which is not an argument for not passing the legislation. So I'm not saying that there should not be progressive legislation. In some cases, progressive legislation might be actually harmful. It might be harmful because once you pass the legislation, people begin to believe that you've actually resolved the problem. You haven't resolved the problem at all. Right? But now for us, the more interesting question, the one that is more germane and gets us to the heart of the question is, so how exactly does one explain the rise of dowry debts? That's what we're interested in. And for a moment, I want you to turn your attention to what I've written on the board over here, the difference between dowry and bride price. Recall my earlier discussion that I had mentioned that in some communities in India, such as tribal communities, low caste communities, what was in fact actually much more common was bride price rather than dowry. So what is dowry? Dowry, so W here refers to woman, M refers to man. So in a dowry marriage, the woman goes to the husband's home. It's going to be a very, very rare case where after a marriage, the man actually settles in the woman's house. That would be a very rare case. And her parents. That would be a highly, highly unusual. So we're looking at the norm here. We're not looking at exceptions here. The woman goes to the man's home. Under the system of marriage where bride price prevails, it's the same thing. A woman gets married and she moves into her husband's home, or they set up a new home. That would be the second option, which you would find in dowry as well. But as I said, that's only something that's becoming a bit more common nowadays. It was certainly not common for a long time, even in the 20th century. But the big difference between dowry and bride price is that in a dowry, dowry is what a woman brings with her. Okay, she brings with her, it comes with the marriage, and it includes such things as jewelry very often. And there's a very interesting and complicated discussion about whether the jewelry is to be retained by her or whether it becomes part of the possessions of her husband as well. Because very often if she was moving into a joint family and she's bringing a dowry, so let's say the dowry includes 1 refrigerator, 2 TV sets, well, this all becomes part of the common household. And if she's setting up a separate home with her husband, then it becomes part of their joint possessions. But the understanding always was, by the way, and it's a tacit understanding. So when I say tacit, I don't mean that it's written down in law, but this is customary. It was always the case that when the woman brought jewelry with her, this jewelry remained in her possession. Okay? But otherwise, the goods flow from the woman to the man's home. In a situation where you're bride price, the man has to bring something, which could very often simply be cash. It could simply be cash. That before the woman's parents would allow her to be married off to bloke A, B, or C, that particular bloke must bring something with him, which could be a cash endowment, right? Or it could be something else. Right? So that's the difference between dowry and bride price. And then, of course, the difference is that bride price was to be found only in certain kinds of communities, such as tribal communities, lower caste communities, right? And dowry was much more prevalent in upper caste communities. Now, the question is, why do we see an acceleration of dowry debts, right? And let's just ignore for a moment those people who argue that this phenomenon always took place. It's just that we're more aware of it now because we happen to be living in more aware times. Frankly, I don't think that's entirely satisfactory, because you do see a dramatic increase, right? And it's not the case that certain investigative journalism suddenly, arose. Let's take a random date, 1970, and we say that before that there was no investigative journalism, and now suddenly the journalists have become aware of this problem. No, I don't think that that's the case. I think that in order to understand why these dowry debts started to rise, we have to understand a number of things. One, to use a phrase that used to be used by sociologists all the time, that phrase is a revolution of rising expectations. What I mean by that is that slowly you have the emergence of a middle class. Now you have one of the consequences of the rise of the middle class, and I discussed this explicitly in a different context, is the rise of consumerism, rampant consumerism. And it is no surprise that in all of these cases of dowry deaths, we saw that the dowry demand would include very often from the groom's family. So the groom's family would say to the bride's family that before we agree to have this woman come into our house as our daughter-in-law, she must bring with her, as part of her dowry, 3 refrigerators, 3 TV sets, 5 radios, whatever the case might be. Now that's consumerism. See, in other words, I think that traditional societies had a way of placing certain restraints upon themselves. And to say that is not to glorify traditional societies, but to simply suggest that there are certain restraints that people placed upon themselves in traditional societies. That's what the English social historian E.P. Thompson wrote about when he talked about the political economy of the rural countryside. That when you had food riots, there were still limits to what people would do. There were limits to people's greed. These limits have slowly evaporated. And not just evaporated in India, they've evaporated in large parts of the world, which is one reason why you have enormous gaps between the super rich and the super poor, gaps that every statistic database that we have, every database that we have suggests that this gap is rising in virtually every country that we can think of. Okay? So one, we're talking about the rise of the middle class, and 2, related to that, the increase of consumerism. Third, something I spoke about again before, but now this is the context in which we have to think about it. Sanskritization. Remember, what is Sanskritization? Sanskritization is when the phenomenon of what happens when the lower classes begin to emulate the upper classes. So you're a member of the lower caste community, lower class community, you come into money, you want to have respectability. What do? You start to emulate the upper classes. So communities that used to practice bride price slowly will now gravitate towards dowry. Right? Because this is the way in which you gain respectability. And a very simple illustration of that would be lower caste communities that are really lower caste communities, and they eat beef, which of course no upper caste Hindu would do. So when a lower caste person wants to Sanskritize himself or herself, one of the first things that they will do is they will stop eating beef. Right? That's what it means to Sanskritize. So rise of the middle class, number 1, rise of consumerism, number 2, number 3, Sanskritization. Number 4, okay, why is it that these deaths took place largely in urban areas? And not just in urban areas, but if you do very detailed sociological work, one of the things that was found out by many of the researchers was that in fact a great many of these deaths took place in cities like Delhi and in the near proximity to Delhi. Now, I come from that part of India, and I know what is a rampant view of people, the kind of communities that I come from. So for example, I'm a Punjabi, which will not mean something to all of you. Some of you will understand what that means. But the Punjabis, for example, are very often stereotyped as people without culture. The Bengalis always used to tell the Punjabis, you've got agriculture, we have got culture. Okay, that used to be the big stereotype between the Bengalis, who were all supposedly educated, elite, all immersed in classical music, right? And then there were these peasant types like myself, so to speak. Okay, that was the split. Now, the relevance of all of this is that Delhi, and again, something that's been mentioned in a different context, explicitly by myself in this class, and that was that what was the population of Delhi before 1947? Less than 500,000. What is its population today? 21 million. The second largest city in the world. Okay? Now what does that mean? What that means is that these are cities that have grown up in an incredibly shorter period of time. but they've not really grown up in other ways. There's a huge lag between the accumulation of capital in the city, political capital, economic capital, right? And what you might describe as moral capital. There's a huge gap between the two. Communities cannot be established over a period of generation. They are established over a period of several generations. Because one of the ways in which you check something like dowry debts is when there is enough social pressure within a community to check that. That if a family starts to misbehave towards the daughter-in-law that has come in there, neighbors will start to pounce upon the family. Now, this did not happen in Delhi. It would have happened in cities in India where there were long-established communities. Delhi was essentially a city of refugees and migrants. And the bulk of the population comes into Delhi in the post-1947 period. Massive acceleration. The 1984 killings that took place, which in the aftermath of Mrs. Gandhi's death, a lot of these killings took place in what are called the Trans-Yamuna colonies. So the Yamuna is a river that flows through Delhi. We don't want to call it a river anymore. It's one of the most polluted bodies of water in the world. I'm telling you, right? But it's a river, officially. A sacred river. And so the communities that are established across the river, these are new communities. These are communities of refugees, migrants, industrial labor, poor people. And I'm not saying that poor people are more likely to riot or they're less disciplined. That's the stereotype. But what is true is that these are people who have come into residential areas very recently. They do not have the kind of social cohesiveness that a more traditional established community has. Now, when you do not have social cohesiveness in a community, what that means is you do not have the kind of social checks that you really need in order to be able to shame the people who are taking part in these kinds of activities. Because one of the things that has been found out by researchers like myself, who have looked into this question in great detail, and we were astonished initially when we started to find this out, was that the same man who, in association very often with his own mother and other members of the family, orchestrates an accident in which his young bride is burned to death, that same man will do what? 3 months later, he will go out and get married again. Why does he do that? Because he gets a second dowry. He gets a second dowry. Right? Now, if this man was truly grieving, because of the loss of his wife and so forth and so on, he's not simply going to do another economic transaction, because that's what it is. It's an economic transaction. And that's the fifth thing. That when a society, or some elements or some segments of that society, now suddenly begin to engage in a cost calculation, okay, then you begin to, in fact, in some ways, diminish the value of human life. And the lives of women are more expendable because in many of these families, the woman is someone who will be seen as not being productive. Right? So this is how the cost calculation takes place. You see that a woman's productivity and her reproductive value, they have to be higher than the cost of maintaining her. If they're not higher than the cost of maintaining her, then she's a liability. And if she's a liability, then you orchestrate an accident and get rid of her. Right? That's what we're talking about. And it sounds absolutely cold, ruthless, brutal. Well, it is cold, ruthless, and brutal. There's just no other way to talk about it. There's no way of disguising this and saying that, well, no, this really was an accident. We don't know what happened. And very often what they try to do is that, the woman is burned to death. Well, the cops might be brought in some of these cases, and then the woman will give a dying declaration. If she's coherent enough at that point, she's got 50% body burns or 80%, whatever the case might be. Now, as a reaction to this whole thing, and this is one of the reasons why dowry debts have diminished, and this is where legislation can help. Okay, so partly as a consequence of this epidemic of dowry debts, one of the things that the Indian state did was they passed a law. And the law was that if any woman dies within 7 years of her marriage on account of anything other than natural causes. So let's say the coroner issues a report and says, well, she had an heart attack. Okay, that's a natural cause. But if she died within 7 years of her marriage on account of anything other than a natural cause, you have to perform an autopsy on the body and you have to open up a criminal investigation into the case. And of course, it sounds very progressive legislation, it is, but then of course the families that are really wealthy, if you're wealthy enough, if you're crazy enough to burn your young daughter-in-law, you're certainly going to be crazy enough to try to bribe the police officials who have been appointed to investigate the case, right? So this did not fully resolve all the problems, but it certainly went part of the way to trying to ameliorate this problem. And what we're concluding, not a conclusion that many of you will necessarily be happy with, or that most social researchers would be happy with, but the conclusion is that this is another instance where modernity might in fact actually introduce certain problems that aggravate the situation of women. To say this is not to say now that women should therefore be relegated to conventional, traditional social roles. That's not the argument. But what we're saying is that this navigation towards modernity in societies such as India can be immensely difficult for women in particular, because modernity doesn't just simply provide new challenges and new opportunities, it also provides new hazards, right? And I'm not, again, giving you the full complicated picture, but I think I've complicated enough for you to have some understanding of how is it that this phenomenon arose and why it became such an enormous problem. Now some people, I'll get you in 1 second, Sharon. Some people will simply say that, look, I mean, the simplest way to look at this is to simply say that this is another illustration of a patriarchal society. But of course, that's a very vague kind of comment. We know that almost everything is an illustration of patriarchal society, so that's not going to be particularly helpful. And in fact, actually, one of the problems here is that we can't assume that patriarchy works exactly the same way in every society. There may be some things that are common in how patriarchy operates from one society across another society, and there may be some things that are quite particular. And therefore, what we would have to ask ourselves is, what are the particular social responses that are called for in this kind of situation? Sharon, you had a question.
Yes. So the husband that his wife burns and then he gets married 3 months later, is he coming from a community that doesn't have that long line of generations? Is he poor? Like, where does he come from?
Not necessarily. No, in fact, actually, see, you have to remember that the context is, what was dowry? Dowry was what a woman brought with her to help set up a home. So dowry would consist, about several months ago, I was going through my parents' papers and I found the original dowry list that my mother, because what they did was they made up a list. So this was a list of things that my mother brought with her as a dowry. Okay? And what did the list consist of? 2 frying pans, 2 sets of linen, 3 pillowcases, 2 pillows, 1 blanket. That's what it consisted of. I mean, I'm not giving you the full list, but household items. In these cases, what was the demand for dowry? The demand for dowry was, it'd be nice to have a BMW. I mean, there were people who were actually saying the woman has to bring with her a BMW, a Mercedes. Now, of course, those are extreme cases. But it may be, the demand may be, well, the woman must bring with her enough cash so that the husband's brother can then go to UCLA on a scholarship. Right? There were cases like that. These are not people coming from poor families. And I'm glad you asked a question, because it's a way for me to answer it, to restate what I'd said in a different way. One should not assume, as most people will assume, 99% people will assume, in a casual conversation, these things are what happened in backward medieval rural India. No. These are things that are happening In urban India, among the most educated and most progressive societies. And I know this is not the message to convey to those who are getting educated, because the argument here is not that education is the root of all problems, but neither is it the root of all solutions, which is a liberal panacea. The liberal view is, education. Mahatma Gandhi in 1930s was visited by an English Protestant missionary, and the missionary asked him, he stayed there for several days with Gandhi, and then he asked him, and I'll just tell you this anecdote and you'll see why I'm mentioning it. He said to Gandhi, what is it that gives you the greatest hope? You've been working in India with the masses for years now. What is it that gives you the greatest hope? And Gandhi said, after pondering just for a second, he said, the fact that most of the people of India are still adhering to the path of non-violence in our struggle for independence. This is what gives me the greatest hope. And then the missionary said, what fills you with the greatest despair? And Gandhi did not hesitate for a second. He said, what fills me with the greatest despair is the hard-heartedness of the educated. The hard-heartedness of the educated. The coldness of the educated. Okay? So that I'm just setting it up that way. And again, as I said, the inference to be drawn from this is not that we do away with education. Why am I in the business of education, so to speak? No, but rather it's to make us reflect about things that we take to be certain. One last question, and I have to move on to the next subject. Yeah.
What's been the response of the women's side of the family?
What was the response of?
The women's side of the family, regarding...
Oh, the women's side of the family, very often what they would attempt to do is obviously go to the police, right? That was what you did. You see, I'm not sketching out all the details, because then I'd have to look at case histories. But what happens in these cases, it's not as though the dowry debt takes place the minute the woman arrives at the home of the husband. She gets married, she arrives at the home of her husband. A week later, the man says, oh, darling, do you think your parents could bring in a little bit more money for you? Because we don't have enough to run the household. Now, what's going to happen? Slowly, the demands continue to accelerate. 2 weeks later, they're asking for more. 3 weeks later, what does the woman do? What does the young daughter-in-law do? She goes back to her natal home, and she tells her parents, I need a bit more money. Okay, I need a scooter. I need, they're asking for an automobile. Can you do that? Can you give it? Right? These demands will accelerate, so there's harassment very often over a period of time. And then, of course, the problem is that a crime has not been committed so far. And technically, by the way, what's one problem for the bride's family to go to the police? Remember, the giving and taking of dowry is illegal. They're already committed an illegal act, the bride's family as well, because they should not have given dowry in the first place. If they go to the cops and say, this man is harassing me, okay, you know what the cops will say? They'll say, well, you've actually committed a legal offense. And very often there have been cases where what they do is they take the bride's family and haul them into jail. There have been cases like that. So that's the short answer to your question. You can see, I'm sorry, I have to, because I've got huge amounts of material to cover. Okay, but this is, I think, the context that you should think of. Let me just close this with a very brief set of observations. One is not, the idea is not to give you a picture here and say that, look, it's a mix of the good and the bad. I mean, that would be pedestrian. That would be extremely boring. It's always a mix of the good and the bad. I mean, if you look at the position of women here, or you look at the position of African Americans and say, well, there's some things that are going well for them, and then there's some things that are not going so well for them. That's not the idea. The idea here was to look at, in this case, a problem such as dowry debts, look at it somewhat systematically, not exhaustively, but somewhat systematically, try to understand what accounts for this phenomenon, and then put it within the larger problematic. The larger problematic is what interests us most. That apparently the liberal view has us believe that as we move along in time, we become more progressive, we become more modern, we abandon our prejudices, right, our baser instincts. Well, I think that we need to question that paradigm. And that's one reason why we're looking at something like dowry debts, right? That's one reason. The other case that I looked at, the Shah Bano case, the intent there was different. The intent there was to look at the intersectionality of gender, religion, law in India and see what are some of the complications. Because as I was trying to point out, the feminist groups, for example, are going to be split about what you're going to do in a case like this. Do you advocate the rights of a woman? But what if what is being advocated as her right or as her entitlement clashes with some other entitlement that she has as a Muslim? Right? How do you negotiate these kinds of things? And what is the relationship of the various communities in India to what we call the secular framework of the Indian Constitution? Because what does Article 44 of the Indian Constitution state? Article 44 of the Indian Constitution states very clearly that it would be desirable to have a uniform civil code in India, that all communities should be subject to the same rules and regulations and stipulations, not just in criminal matters, but in civil matters, in matters having to do with marriage, inheritance, adoption, divorce, separation, so forth and so on. Right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, but I also need to add that we're not looking at a complete picture of, obviously, the place of women in Indian society. So, for example, just to give you one illustration, and then I'll conclude with that, one of the things I've not talked about is environmental movements in India. And I think that there have been environmental/ecological movements. The two words are not exactly the same, but just for the sake of convenience, let's assume they are. That these environmental/ecological movements, I think, have been a significant force. And they've been a significant force because many of these are grassroots movement. Why do people take part in an environmental movement? They take part because that community is adversely affected. It's adversely affected by such things as global warming. Right? Now, if you've got deforestation going on in the Himalayas, well, one of the consequences of extreme deforestation is flooding. Flooding, right? And if flooding takes place, obviously certain communities are more adversely affected. Generally, the communities that are most adversely affected are those communities that happen to be marginalized. They're marginalized either because they're women, or they're tribals, or they're lower caste or lower class, and very often the combination of all of them. Right? These are the communities that are going to be most adversely affected, usually. And I gave the illustration that, if you look at the United States, 95% of the toxic wastes and hazardous wastes and nuclear wastes, you don't think you're going to find it in Westwood or in Beverly Hills. They're going to be found next to American Indian communities. That's a fact. Because that's a community that is the most impoverished, the least able to speak up for itself. And in these movements, women have unquestionably in India been important. They've unquestionably been important. And they're important because, as to reiterate what I've just said, because they are the ones who are most adversely affected often. So the very famous movement that they had, it's called the Chipko movement, again inspired by Gandhi. Chipko. The word Chipko is, for those of you who know Hindi, Urdu, you would know, Chipakna is to hug, right? So it's called the Chipko movement because this happened in Uttarakhand, in the what I'm going to call the lower foothills of the Himalayas. This is not 20,000. We're talking about altitudes of 10 to 13, 14,000 feet, led by a number of major environmentalists, one of whom is still alive in his late 80s. I actually went to the place where he did the movement 30 years ago, Sundarlal Bahugna. And it's called the Chipko movement because when people who were in the lumber industry, when they came to chop down the trees and haul it away as lumber, these women just clung to the trees. They chained themselves literally to the trees because they said these trees are the source of her livelihood. They are our air, they are our soil, they are our water, so to speak. Right? And this became a mass movement, and it had some effects. I mean, in some of the cases, these lumber companies had to withdraw. Right? But this movement, the women were actually critical. So I think that if we wanted to obviously do a more comprehensive examination of women's places in India, we'd have to certainly look at such things. And that when we speak about women being in the public sphere, it just doesn't mean being out in the street in an urban area and lounging around with friends, just as men do, but it also means entering into the public sphere in these different kinds of political ways, such as joining or leading or instigating an environmental movement. All right? Okay. We are now on to the last segment of the class, because the last lecture will obviously be a set of reflections on where India is today, including such things as India's aspirations to be a world power. What are some of the problems there? But the last segment here is something that I think is actually something that we really have to have some understanding of, and that is popular and public culture in India, including, of course, what is called Bollywood. And here again, we cannot get into all the nuances. The word Bollywood itself is of fairly recent vintage and not used appropriately, really, because it refers technically to a certain kind of Hindi film, but now it's used to refer to mainstream Hindi cinema. It is also important to mention, just simply so that you understand it, that most people think of Indian cinema as Bollywood, and Bollywood films are films that are made in Hindi. And this industry is centered in Bombay, right, or Mumbai, as it's now known, the second largest city in India. Used to be the largest city until Delhi overtook it just a very short time ago. So that's where the industry has been centered. However, Indian cinema is far larger than Bollywood. The cinemas of South India, films made in Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, we're talking about hundreds of films made. And in some parts of the Indian diaspora, in Singapore and Malaysia, for example, where the Indian population comes largely from South India, the films that are most popular are films that are made in Tamil and Malayalam and Telugu. Right? That's another cinema altogether. So that's one observation. The second observation is that, however widespread the influence of Hollywood, however dominant the metaphors of Hollywood, notwithstanding all of that, Bollywood, or Indian, Bombay-based cinema, and more broadly Indian cinema, has its own conventions. It has its own conventions, it has its own following, and it generates a passion that I do not think can be understood in the United States. When an Indian film star dies, this happened a few years ago, a major Indian film star from South India died, the whole city came to a standstill for days. I mean, and it's like a mass funeral. I mean, there are millions of people who go out into the streets. The twin passions that animate life in India are Bollywood, but Bollywood now I'm using as a synonym for all Indian cinemas, and cricket. Okay, these are the twin passions. And then, of course, if you make a film which brings in both, such as Lagan, which was made about 10-12 years ago, then you've got a hit. You don't really have to do very much, right? Other than be moderately smart and moderately good only. But these are the twin passions. We will talk a little bit about the culture of cricket later on, but what we are interested in here is cinema. However, before I get to the subject of cinema, it's important that we make some distinctions. And these distinctions go well beyond what I'm going to say in class today. And you don't have to agree with the way in which I've drawn up these distinctions, but I'm certainly hoping that it'll set you thinking. There are 4 terms we need to think about, which are written on the board here: classical culture, popular culture, mass culture, folk culture. Okay? In the United States, I would say the main opposition, the classical opposition, is popular culture and classical culture. Okay? So popular culture would include things such as pop music, rock music. Elvis Presley was popular culture. Nobody in his or her right mind would call Elvis Presley classical culture. Of course, there are ways in which you can now say that this gap is bridged. What would be an instance of popular classical culture? does anybody here listen to Western classical music? Somebody here must listen to Western classical music. I know it's not the in thing if you're at this age probably, but yeah.
Are you talking about like Johnny Cash, like Conway Twitty?
Johnny Cash, I don't know if I would consider that classical culture. Let's take classical music. Okay, Western classical music, yes.
The jazz artists of the early 20th century is a great example of popular music bridging into classical. If you listen to a classical radio station, they play Gershwin nowadays. And
yes.
He was one of the pioneers of jazz.
Okay, but you know, jazz is already veering more towards the classical. In other words, jazz is not heard usually by the hundreds of millions.
Not nowadays, but
yeah.
half a century.
Yeah. So that's an interesting illustration of where something might transition from one category into another category. Okay, but we don't want to complicate it that way. We want to just say, so if you listen to classical Western music, if I said Beethoven, there is not a person in this room, I think, who doesn't know who Beethoven is. Well, let's not think about Beethoven the dog, because in America they've got all weird things going on. You know, dogs named that called Beethoven and Mozart and God knows what all, right? But you know, if I told my 3-year-old daughter Beethoven when she was 3 years old, she immediately thought Beethoven referred to a dog. You know, well, no. We know who Beethoven is, okay? Because Beethoven would be a very good illustration of a person who belongs in the repertoire of classical music, but who is popular, immensely popular. Okay, well, maybe not as popular as the Rolling Stones, let's say, were, or the Beatles, but nonetheless very popular. On the other hand, if I mention to you Olivier Messiaen, how many here, does anybody here know this person's name? No. So he's a major composer of what you would call classical music, a French composer, okay? And you really have to know classical music. Now that's classical, that's not popular classical. So that's an illustration of where we might say that, well, it's possible to actually make further refinements. But I think you understand what I mean when I say that the classical opposition in the West, is between classical culture and what you would call popular culture. So classical culture would include such things as opera. That's classical culture. Okay? It's high culture. Classical here would mean high as well. If popular would usually mean low culture. Not always. There could be exceptions. So we were just given an illustration of jazz, for example, which you really can't call low culture. And at one point, it would probably have been viewed, it was in fact part of the repertoire of people more generally, and then it moves into more rarefied circles, you know, right? Okay? But you see the distinction between popular culture and, so let's say if you were to take something like Japanese anime, okay, right? In some ways you could think of that as popular culture, but not entirely, and this is what brings me now to the next distinction between popular culture and mass culture. Most people think the two terms are synonymous. They're not. They're actually quite different. What would be an illustration of something that might be mass culture but is not popular culture, if one can think of that? And the answer would be you couldn't, because if it's mass culture, it's popular. However, there may be things that are part of popular culture, but they're not part of mass culture. What does mass culture mean? Anybody? Just speculate. Yes, Dominic.
Something that's observed by nearly everyone in a group, in a country.
But that would be the same as popular in a way. When have we always had mass culture? In the West, for example, have we always had mass culture? When did mass culture, you're nodding your head and saying no, right?
Yeah. Mass culture in a sense, like unifying factor?
Explain a bit more.
Culture in a sense to which everyone could attribute to being part of their identity in terms of like it.
No, but that again goes towards popular culture. When did mass culture arise in Western society? Yeah. Something like what?
Like texting.
Texting.
Like
Okay. So what makes possible texting? What are the what?
Smartphone, like that's mass culture. I think a majority of the world.
What does the word mass here suggest other than popular? No, but I don't mean in terms of physics now. I don't mean mass culture. When we say television introduced mass culture, what does that mean? Yes. Sorry? Technology. Okay, but when you write an essay, by the way, do not give me one word. Okay? So explain if you may, please. What does technology permit that was not possible before?
Accessibility to everyone.
Accessibility, but let's put it in more precise terms. It permits, allows the mass reproduction of a certain thing. Classical music could never have come into the domain of popular culture but for the fact that you have mechanical means of reproduction. When did mechanical means of reproduction become possible? In the 19th and 20th century. Right? You cannot have mass culture before the mechanical means of reproduction of something become possible. And mechanical means of reproduction include such things as obviously recorders, recording machines, televisions. Why do some people still want to go to a play? Because you see things in flesh. It's not being reproduced mechanically. Of course, you could now do a live telecast of the play. That's a different thing. But let's suppose you didn't. So if you have a Shakespeare festival, that's the whole point. And they say no cameras permitted, nothing. Right? It's still a special experience because it's not also available to the masses. You have to go and pay your ticket. So the difference would be going to the opera and just sitting at your home and listening to opera your whole life and never actually having gone to an opera. The fact that you can do that has to do with the mechanical means of reproduction. That's when something can possibly enter into the domain of mass culture. Not everything that is popular culture enters into the domain of mass culture. From India, now let's shift the scene to India. From India, the best example would be something like kite flying. For those who come from Pakistan, you would understand that too. Because in Pakistan and in India and in Bangladesh, one of the things that people very often used to do, it's decreasing slowly. One of the reasons it's decreasing is because of the influence of mass culture. It's like my son, he'd much rather be with an iPad all day long or an iPhone. Who the hell wants to go to the rooftop and fly a kite, a paper kite? Okay? But kite flying was popular culture. It was not something that was done by the elites. Okay? Only. It was done by everybody. But it cannot become part of mass culture because there are no means for the mechanical reproduction of this thing, of this phenomenon. I hope you understand. This is a crucial distinction because, as I said, most people will use this interchangeably. All forms of mass culture are necessarily popular. But all forms of popular culture are not necessarily mass culture. Hindi cinema is both mass culture and popular culture. It's mass culture because obviously cinema involves the mechanical means of reproduction. You have one DVD, you plug it in, and 5,000 people can see it. 50 million people can see it. You just have to keep on copying the DVD and send it to different cinema halls. Right? You cannot do that with kite flying or playing marbles on the streets, which is what we used to do when we were growing up. That's popular culture. It's not mass culture. That's a distinction. And then finally, folk culture. In the United States, in the West more generally, folk culture, frankly, no longer really exists. It only exists in very, very small pockets. Very, very, very small pockets, if at all. There is no such thing really as folk culture because folk culture is the culture that is very local, very indigenous, very vernacular. Extremely vernacular. Okay? That's what folk culture is. Now, I'll give you an illustration. And this is important because the Hindi film draws on folk culture as well. And I'm not going to be able to show all of that to you in my discussion of this particular film, Deewaar, today, and in my continuing lecture on this on Tuesday. But I need to mention it to you so that you can begin to think about it when you see films, not just like this one, but all other Indian films. Now, folk culture, as I said, is something that in the West can frankly no longer be encountered. In India, there are still large pockets of folk culture. Why are there very large pockets of folk culture? Partly because the mechanical means of reproduction has not caught on everywhere, partly because the reach of the state is not everywhere. Many places still remain unconnected in some ways. But those are only, of course, the overt reasons. They're much more sophisticated reasons. And those reasons may have to do with the fact that the people who are, at this point in time are not sold on the idea that culture is something that is universal. Okay? And that in order to partake in culture, you have to partake in these universal aspects of culture, such as Hollywood cinema, for example. Now, folk culture can be a bit of a problem, and I'll give you the illustration here. Now, there are many immigrants. And remember that America, of course, is a society made up of immigrants. You could be one generation, you could be 5 generations, but everyone has come from somewhere else. Okay? Barring the American Indians, everyone has come from somewhere else. In many immigrant groups, you still find the phenomenon where they are imagining what their culture was like, which they have lost contact with. You know, so it's like a Bulgarian, and this has been documented, it's like a Bulgarian living here, okay, and imagines that, oh, there's this dance form, and goes back to Bulgaria because they think they're going to find it there. Well, Bulgaria's moved on, right? It's only in your imagination. But what they'll do, what that state of Bulgaria will do, is because they want to encourage all of these people who are heritage students, as it were, you know, heritage people, they want to go back and discover their heritage. They'll say, we'll put on a dance for you. And this is the invention of tradition. This is what historians and theorists call the invention of tradition. They say, this is a 19th century Bulgarian dance. This should satisfy you. Now you're seeing your real authentic culture. You know, that's what all the NRIs do. NRI is non-resident Indians, you know. So there's this culture show that's put on every year here. You know, I used to go to it regularly because I document these things, you know, and study them, right? And, you know, their idea of what India was like, I mean, it's frozen in time completely. Completely frozen in time, you know. And so they would do this folk dance of Kerala. Well, you go to Kerala and see if you can find that folk dance. You can't, you know. So this folk culture, what is it? It's basically, in many countries, it's strictly for tourists now. And for heritage people who are coming back, right? It's like a museum piece now, essentially. But in India, this is not entirely what folk culture is, for reasons that I've already mentioned to you. Namely, the fact that there are huge pockets of people, huge number of communities, which for various reasons are still not part of the dominant homogenizing forces that produce a uniform kind of culture. Right? That's still not happened in India. And of course, it's in that context that we have to see Bollywood, because the critics of Bollywood will argue invariably that Bollywood is profoundly troubling, not only because it's sexist and this and that, right? The usual isms can all be applied, so we won't go through the list, you know, right? But that it homogenizes. It homogenizes Indian culture, and now what's happening is that people who were not really part of the dominant culture, and Bollywood is slowly entering into these communities. We'll have to assess whether, in fact, this is the case or not. And my submission to you is that that's not entirely correct. Okay? And we're going to try to see, when we analyze this film, as I said, we won't finish with it today, but we'll try to see when we analyze this film what really goes on. Now, why should one be interested in popular Indian cinema? when one is looking at the history of India post 1947. Right? So a few brief remarks, and then we'll see one clip from here. And then on Tuesday, I'm going to comment on the clip. I'm not going to have time to comment on it today, and I want you to think about it, about what's happening in this clip. Okay? But a few comments before that. So here are a few questions. How many of you, by the way, just so that I know, how many of you here have seen, other than Deewaar, how many of you have seen some other Indian film? So roughly half. Okay. So here are a few questions for you. Think about it. Number one, why is it the case that so many Hindi films have songs? And because they have songs, and the vast majority have songs, should we call them musicals, which is what many people call them? They call them musicals. Frankly, I think that's completely inappropriate. You know, and not only inappropriate, it reveals nothing. Because what does it do? The person who calls it a musical is thinking of a genre called the musical, which was prevalent in Hollywood, which has, by the way, disappeared from Hollywood too. But you know, it was very common in Hollywood. Another genre that more or less disappeared, it kind of comes back in a different form once in a while, is the Western. Right? You've seen the Western, right? The man on the horse, you know, riding off into the sunset, right? Fascinating films for what they tell you about America, but that's a genre. Many people who study cinema in the West, they think of genres. So science fiction is a genre, the Western is a genre, musical is a genre, the film noir is a genre. Fascinating genre, right? Film noir. These are all genres. And what they do is they immediately assume that we're going to use the same concept when we start studying mainstream Indian cinema. And we shouldn't. Because these films are not musicals. Right? And then, of course, we have to ask, so this is the second part of that first question, and you're not going to be asked this question, by the way, in your exam, because you know, I don't expect you to know why Hindi films have songs, and there are lots of theories about that. Okay? But the question that follows is, so we do know that they have songs, so how do we interpret these songs? Right? Is this an occasion because the Hindi film used to be let's take a satirical view of it. The Hindi film used to be 3.5 hours long at one point. Then it got to be 3 hours. Now it's still very long, by the way. That's one problem with studying Hindi cinema. You've got to sit through long films. And if they happen to be very bad, which many of them are, then it's torture, frankly. But so one common satirical view was, well, you know, you need a bathroom break, so that's what you do during the song. You go off to the bathroom, you know. You're not missing anything, right? That was a satirical view, right? Then there's this view that, much more sophisticated view, that the characters in the song can say what they cannot say in the dialogue. They cannot say in the dialogue what they can say in the song. So let's supposing a woman is pining for a lover, or a man is pining for his lover, and there's some act of transgression involved in that love. It's across caste, across religion, and the song, you can say that, but you cannot say it in dialogue. Right? So there are various ways in which we can interpret the Hindi film song. Is it a way to advance the narrative, except that you now take 10 years and you put it all into one song? So you see, you know, and very often in a song, by the way, you saw that the heroine had gone through like 8 changes of clothing in 3 minutes, right? Because, of course, it's representing different phases. It's the collapse of time. That's what's happening. It's not like the fashion designer is saying, hey, this is a wonderful opportunity for me to put out 8 different types of costumes, right? That maybe some of that too. There may be some of that too, but what we're talking about is that there may be a way to advance, okay, the story, right? I have to finish because I want to continue with my train of thought and just lay it out for you. So that's one question. I'm giving you a few questions for you to think about. Secondly, and very few, if anyone in this room would really know this to be the case, but take my word for it, unless you've seen these Hindi films. And these Hindi films of the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, for example, where you had the hero and the villain. And then the villain, of course, always had an army, as it were, right? He's got associates, bunch of hooligans, and gundas they are called. Gundas is the word that's used in in South Asia, right? You know, so that at the end, of course, they have a fight. And guess what? After the last punch, that's when the cops arrive. It's always after the last punch. So the question is, why do the cops always arrive so late in the Hindi film? Why do they always arrive so late? Why didn't they arrive 3 minutes earlier and help the hero? Right? And you could say, of course, the reason why that was the case was because this shows the hero in a great light. He can tackle 50 of these hooligans all by himself. And if you've seen the Hindi film, you know they do it, right? I mean, one man will dispatch 50 of them into oblivion. Right? Okay? Right? But no, that would be way too simple, frankly. You'd have to think of something else. Right? Why does a cop always arrive so late? And one theory I would advance is because the Hindi filmmaker tacitly always was expressing the dominant view of that society. What was the dominant view of that society? That the state is useless. The state is not going to help you. You have to help yourself. You have to help yourself. Because what does the police represent? It represents the arm of the state. That's what Ferguson is all about. Why do you think there's so much anger directed against the police? It's an arm of the state. And what is a state? A state is an entity that has the monopoly on the use of force. No one else can use violence. If you do, there are consequences. The state claims legitimate monopoly over the use of violence. And that legitimate violence that the state claims for itself, it's either the army or internally the police. So the police arrives too late, partly because it is an expression of the sentiment on the part of the director who's reflecting the views of the dominant view of that society, that the state, frankly, cannot be relied upon to procure equality or justice. Okay? But that's an interesting question. And here's a third question. And this one takes us to this film, which is why this is the third question for you. I can give you 50, but we'll restrict ourselves to 3. It'll take us to this film because all of you, if you've seen the film, you know it's got 2 brothers. Okay? Now, almost every second Hindi film had either brothers, 2 brothers, 3 brothers. You know, there's this very famous film, it's called Amar, Akbar, Anthony. So Amar is the Hindu name, Akbar is the Muslim name, Anthony is, of course, the Christian name. So many people saw this as a film that was also a film about the national unity of India. 3 heroes, 3 brothers. And in all of these films, and there are hundreds, thousands of them, frankly, thousands of them. Okay, and there are variations on this. And I'll tell you the variations in a second. So the double, for example. The double is very, very common. Of course, you find the double in the West, too. You know, you find it in Dostoevsky. Okay? Famous film by Kurosawa. Akira Kurosawa, Kagemusha, which is about the double. So forth and so on. I could get examples from different cultures, but this goes way beyond that. Way beyond that. Right? I mean, every second Hindi film has either twins or brothers or doubles. Why do they do it? Why do they have that? Right? And in this case, you've got brothers. And someone here who knows his or her Bible will say, well, isn't this the Abel and Cain story? Right? Abel and Cain, right? Sacrifice, 2 brothers. And you could find the 2 brothers in virtually every culture of the world. Okay? I mean, there are kung fu films where you've got 2 brothers. And what happens, 2 brothers? They go separate ways. Right? And of course, in the Hindi film, one is the smuggler, the other is the cop. And of all the cops in all the world, it had to be that cop in that town, I'm paraphrasing Casablanca, of course, right? Who had to be there at that point in time, and he had to be assigned that job of capturing his brother. Right? That's his, right? So of all the cops that you could have found, it had to be his brother who joined the police service and was then given charge of this job. Okay? Why 2 brothers? Now, another interesting thing that you could think about In many Hollywood films, you have people who have split personalities. That's a common theme in Hollywood. Split personalities. People who are schizophrenic, people who have bipolar disorder, so forth and so on. Hundreds of films over the last several decades. Virtually no Hindi film of that kind. Virtually no Hindi film. Why that difference? Are we not able to deal with these kinds of things in India? Or is there too much, or conversely, is there too much fascination and interest in this here, in this culture? And what I want to suggest to you is very simply the following, that what the Hindi film does, and that's why you often have two brothers or two sisters. What the Hindi film does is it suggests that, look, let me put it in a pedestrian way, simple way. There is the good and the bad within each of us. Okay? We all have split personalities, whether we recognize it or not. Right? There's a part of me that wants to whack my son whenever he does something wrong, and then there's a part of me which says, well, you should never do that because that's exercising violence over someone who cannot respond. Right? And there are different ways in which people have written about this and thought about it, but essentially take it in its most common form that there is a good and the bad within each of us. No one is wholly good, no one is wholly evil, frankly. Now, what the Hollywood film does is it creates that split personality. So it takes that person and it splits it up into internally. What the Hindi film does is it splits it up externally. It takes one person and projects them as two. It projects them as two. So, and in many of these films, as in the Western, so you should see the Western if you haven't seen many Westerns there, I can give you a short list of 3 or 4 that are really fabulous. Okay? Because in the Western, in the classic Western, what did you often find? You often found that the person that you most sympathized with was the person who was actually the villain. Why? Because he was a villain with the good heart. There is no one, I think, and if I'm wrong about this, you should tell me right now or send me an email. There's no one who can watch this film and after having watched the film say that they found the police officer, Ravi, more interesting and more sympathetic than Vijay, the hero of the film. Everyone's heart is going to go out for Vijay, not for Ravi. He's an absolutely dull, boring character. I mean, he's miserably boring, frankly, right? Everything here rests on Vijay. But he's a villain. He's a smuggler. Okay? And that's another set of problems. Why is it that literature and art is able to evoke more sympathy for those who are the villains, for those who are the downtrodden, so forth and so on? But what's happening here? I'm leaving you with that thought. We don't have time to look at this clip today, but we'll start with it on Tuesday. What essentially I'm arguing is that you've got one character who has now been split up externally as two. Okay? So it's the self and the other. It's the self and the disowned part of yourself. The disowned part of yourself is important to think about. That part of yourself which you disown, which you discard. And that is what Vijay is going to remind Ravi about constantly. Okay, so think of it this way, and we'll begin on Tuesday. Please be sure you've watched the film and possibly have read the book.